The conflict between street gangs and organized crime groups represents a complex and evolving struggle for control over the criminal underworld. While both operate outside the law, their structures, methods, and goals often differ significantly. Gangs, typically decentralized, youth-driven, and rooted in neighborhood identity, dominate street-level operations such as drug dealing, extortion, and turf enforcement. In contrast, organized crime groups like the Mafia or cartels are hierarchical, profit-focused enterprises with deep political and financial influence, often engaging in large-scale trafficking, corruption, and white-collar crime. As these two worlds intersect, particularly in drug distribution, human trafficking, and territorial disputes, conflicts arise, sometimes erupting into violent turf wars. These clashes are not only battles for economic control, but also reflect generational, cultural, and strategic divides within the criminal ecosystem. Understanding this dynamic sheds light on the shifting power balance in global organized crime and its impact on urban communities and law enforcement strategies. Number 5. The Purple Gang versus the Italian Mafia, Detroit's underworld war of the 1920s to 1930s. During the Prohibition era, Detroit became a battleground for control of the illegal liquor trade and other lucrative criminal enterprises. Two powerful forces emerged in the city's underworld: the Purple Gang, a largely Jewish-American syndicate, and the Italian Mafia, part of the growing national network of La Cosa Nostra. While both groups thrived off bootlegging, extortion, and racketeering, their shared interests often put them in direct conflict. The rivalry between these two criminal empires marked one of the most intense underworld clashes of the early 20th century. The Purple Gang was formed by Jewish immigrants from Eastern Europe who settled in Detroit's Lower East Side. Most of its early members were tough street kids who graduated from petty theft and extortion to more organized forms of crime under the tutelage of older gangsters. By the early 1920s, as Prohibition took effect with the 18th Amendment, the gang found its true calling in the illegal liquor trade. Led by the Bernstein brothers, Abe, Joe, Ray, and Isidore, the Purple Gang quickly gained a reputation for ruthlessness and unpredictability. They controlled a large portion of the smuggling routes between Detroit and Canada, thanks to the city's strategic location on the Detroit River. This access gave them a near monopoly on alcohol distribution in the region, making them one of the most feared criminal organizations in the Midwest. At the same time, Italian immigrants were building their own criminal networks. The Detroit Mafia, eventually known as the Detroit Partnership, was composed mostly of Sicilian and Calabrian mobsters. Unlike the brash and chaotic Purples, the Italian Mafia was more traditional, secretive, and hierarchical. Initially, the Italians were not as dominant in Detroit as in New York or Chicago, but they were expanding steadily, especially under the leadership of figures like Angelo Mele and Joseph Zerilli. As the Mafia sought to grow its influence in Detroit, it inevitably came into conflict with the Purple Gang, whose control of liquor, gambling, and labor racketeering presented a major obstacle. Throughout the 1920s, the Purple Gang and the Italian Mafia maintained an uneasy coexistence. The Purples had the firepower and the muscle, while the Italians had better organization and long-term strategy. But when money and territory were on the line, violence became inevitable. One of the key flashpoints was the so-called Collingwood Manor Massacre in 1931, where 3 Purple Gang associates were executed gangland style in an apartment. Though officially unsolved, many believed it was retaliation tied to conflicts between rival factions within the Purple Gang, and possibly influenced by Italian mob interests. The killings signaled a turning point in Detroit's criminal landscape. The Mafia also began making inroads into labor racketeering, an area that the Purple Gang had previously dominated, especially in the produce and garment sectors. As Italian crews moved into these territories, shootouts and disappearances increased. One notorious incident involved the assassination of gangster Little Augie Pisano, an associate of the Purple Gang, which many attributed to mafia-linked hitmen. By the early 1930s, internal strife began to fracture the Purple Gang. Their leadership was unstable, and their brutal methods had attracted the full attention of law enforcement. Several members were imprisoned, including some of the Bernstein brothers. Others were killed by rivals or in internal purges. Meanwhile, the Italian Mafia, with its more disciplined structure, adapted better to the changing criminal landscape. As Prohibition ended in 1933, the Mafia pivoted successfully to other enterprises: gambling, loan sharking, narcotics, while the Purples, already weakened, could not maintain their power base. By the mid-1930s, the Purple Gang had largely ceased to exist as a dominant force in Detroit. The Mafia, particularly the Detroit Partnership, filled the power vacuum and maintained control over organized crime in the city for decades to come. The battle between the Purple Gang and the Italian Mafia in Detroit was emblematic of the ethnic rivalries and turf wars that defined early American organized crime. Unlike the Italian Mafia, which integrated into a national syndicate, the Purple Gang remained a regional power. Their violent, flamboyant style ultimately made them unsustainable as a long-term criminal enterprise. Still, the Purple Gang left a deep mark on Detroit's history, and their war with the Mafia remains a fascinating chapter in the story of America's Prohibition-era underworld. Number 4. The Latin Kings vs. The Italian Mafia, Turf Wars in the 1990s, Chicago. In the 1990s, Chicago's underworld was marked by a quiet but potent power struggle between two of the city's most entrenched criminal organizations, the Latin Kings and the Italian Mafia, also known locally as the Chicago Outfit. While these two groups had vastly different origins, cultures, and structures, their interests increasingly collided as drug markets grew more profitable and neighborhoods became battlefields for control. Though never erupting into a full-scale public gang war, the conflict between the Latin Kings and the Mafia in the 1990s was characterized by turf disputes, extortion clashes, and subtle violence that reshaped Chicago's organized crime landscape. The Latin Kings, one of the largest and most organized Hispanic street gangs in the United States, began in the 1940s in Chicago. Originally formed as a self-protection group for Puerto Rican immigrants, it evolved into a sprawling criminal network involved in drug trafficking, weapons sales, and violent enforcement. By the 1990s, the Latin Kings were a dominant force in Chicago's Latino neighborhoods, especially in Humboldt Park, Little Village, and South Lawndale. Their structure was more regimented than other street gangs, resembling a paramilitary organization with ranks, codes, and centralized leadership. In contrast, the Chicago Outfit was a continuation of the Italian-American Mafia's long history in the city, dating back to the days of Al Capone. By the 1990s, the outfit was no longer the dominant force it once was, but still wielded influence through gambling, loan sharking, labor racketeering, and union infiltration. It had a more clandestine approach, often working behind legitimate businesses and political connections to maintain its grip on power. The primary source of friction between the Latin Kings and the Mafia in the 1990s was the drug trade. Historically, the outfit had avoided direct involvement in narcotics due to the federal sentencing risks and preferred to tax or control those who did. However, by the 1990s, the immense profitability of cocaine and heroin trafficking forced the Mafia to reconsider its stance and exert more control over local distribution channels. The Latin Kings were already well established in street-level drug operations. As they grew in power, they resisted any attempts by Mafia figures to impose tribute systems or dictate terms. The outfit, which traditionally maintained a taxation model over independent dealers and gangs operating in its territories, viewed this resistance as a threat to its authority. When Latin King dealers refused to pay kickbacks or operate under Mafia-approved distributors, tensions rose. In neighborhoods where both groups had interests, low-level violence erupted. Drive-by shootings, beatings, and intimidation tactics were common, although the true instigators were often concealed. Unlike the overt gang wars of the Crips and Bloods in other cities, this was a colder conflict, marked by calculated hits and street-level enforcement rather than open warfare. Another key area of friction was extortion. The outfit had long dominated labor unions, construction firms, nightclubs, and adult entertainment venues across the city. But as Latin King members began to enter adulthood and assert control over parts of Chicago's nightlife and informal economy, they too started demanding street taxes from businesses within their territory. This encroachment into traditional mafia rackets further strained relations. The outfit, known for preferring discreet enforcement and financial pressure over public acts of violence, sent messages through intermediaries, threats, offers of profit sharing, or occasional disappearances. Latin Kings, on the other hand, responded with boldness and muscle, unwilling to cede control over their growing economic influence. Law enforcement cracked down hard on both organizations in the 1990s, but in different ways. The Latin Kings were the subject of massive gang sweeps, RICO cases, and street-level investigations. Their open presence and recruitment of young members made them a visible target. Meanwhile, the Mafia faced its own problems. Many top outfit bosses were aging, retiring, or facing federal indictments tied to decades-old murders and financial crimes. Ironically, the weakening of the outfit's upper leadership allowed the Latin Kings to grow with less direct opposition. With the traditional Mafia distracted and weakened by internal decline and law enforcement pressure, the Latin Kings solidified their hold on key neighborhoods and drug markets. By the end of the 1990s, the balance of power in Chicago's underworld had shifted. The Latin Kings were no longer seen as mere street-level thugs, but as a complex and dangerous organization with a hierarchical command and broad influence. The outfit, though still present, retreated further into the shadows, focusing on white-collar crimes and gambling. The undeclared war between the Latin Kings and the Italian Mafia in the 1990s didn't resemble the all-out gang wars seen elsewhere, but it was no less impactful. It marked the fading of the old guard and the rise of new power structures in America's urban criminal ecosystem, driven by demographics, drugs, and the raw economics of the street. Number 3. The Bloods and Crips versus Mafia affiliates. A shadow war in 1980s to 1990s Los Angeles. During the 1980s and 1990s, Los Angeles was at the epicenter of a seismic shift in organized crime. As traditional mafia power structures tried to hold onto influence, newer, more violent, and increasingly entrepreneurial street gangs were rising to dominate the city's lucrative drug trade. Among the most notorious of these gangs were the Bloods and Crips, rival African-American groups with deep roots in south-central LA. While their primary conflict was with each other, both found themselves at odds with mafia-connected figures who sought to exert control or extract profits from street-level narcotics distribution, prostitution, and protection rackets. The result was a shadowy, often unpublicized war for control of Los Angeles's underworld. The Crips were founded in the late 1960s in South Los Angeles and quickly evolved into a decentralized but powerful network of gangs. In response, the Bloods formed in the early 1970s to counter Crip dominance. By the 1980s, both had grown into massive alliances of individual sets involved heavily in drug trafficking, weapons dealing, and turf warfare. Crack cocaine in particular transformed these gangs into street-level empires, violent, well-armed, and financially potent. These gangs operated largely in black neighborhoods and recruited heavily from marginalized youth, offering both identity and economic opportunity. As the crack epidemic exploded in urban centers, the Bloods and Crips expanded their reach, not only within LA, but across the country. While LA has never had a mafia presence as deeply rooted as New York or Chicago, the city has hosted significant mafia-affiliated activity. The Los Angeles crime family, sometimes referred to as the Dragna family after its mid-century boss, was involved in gambling, loan sharking, labor racketeering, and entertainment industry infiltration. More significantly, in the 1980s and 1990s, mafia affiliates, both from the LA family and transplants from East Coast families, tried to maintain control over narcotics distribution and extort profits from growing drug operations. Unlike the visibly chaotic gang wars of the Crips and Bloods, the Mafia operated with a quieter, more business-minded strategy. But as the profits from the street-level drug trade soared, they couldn't ignore the influence of the black gangs. The primary source of conflict between the Bloods, Crips, and Mafia-connected figures was control of the drug market. Mafia associates had traditionally dealt drugs through intermediaries and preferred to tax independent operators rather than engage in street-level dealing. They expected deference from those operating in their territory, even if that territory was informally defined. But the Bloods and Crips were not interested in paying tribute or sharing profits. In many cases, they were the dominant force on the streets, armed with AK-47s and operating with impunity in neighborhoods where police presence was minimal and community ties were strong. In the mid-1980s, a number of incidents pointed to mounting tension. Mafia-connected individuals were allegedly robbed, assaulted, or intimidated by younger gang members refusing to follow the old rules of tribute and control. Rumors spread of retaliatory hits, sometimes contracted through Latino gangs or rogue elements within the Mafia network. Several unsolved killings from that era remain suspected cases of gangland reprisal. Interestingly, in some cases, Mafia affiliates attempted to use Latino prison gangs, most notably the Mexican Mafia, La M, as intermediaries or enforcers. The Mexican Mafia already exerted strong control over the California prison system and had influence over many street-level Latino gangs, Sureños. They also maintained transactional relationships with both Bloods and Crips, depending on the context. This triangular dynamic created a murky underworld where Mafia money, Latino influence, and black street gangs all intersected and occasionally clashed. Some Crip and Blood leaders were approached with offers of partnership, supply deals, or veiled threats. While some localized truces or arrangements emerged, many simply escalated the conflict. Throughout the late 1980s and 1990s, law enforcement began targeting all of these groups with increasing ferocity. The FBI and DEA cracked down on Mafia-controlled rackets, while the LAPD and federal agencies conducted sweeping operations like Operation Hammer, aimed at suppressing gang activity in South Central. Ironically, these crackdowns weakened Mafia affiliates more than the street gangs. The decentralized nature of the Bloods and Crips made them harder to eliminate completely. Their members were younger, more aggressive, and more adaptable. The Mafia, in contrast, was aging and less suited to the violent, fast-moving world of modern street crime. By the end of the 1990s, the Mafia's influence in Los Angeles had significantly declined. The Bloods and Crips had become entrenched criminal enterprises with national reach, expanding into other cities and establishing drug routes across the country. The covert war between these gangs and the Mafia affiliates never reached the public spectacle of open warfare, but its legacy remains. It was a transitional moment in organized crime, a passing of the torch from the old world of the Mafia to the chaotic, decentralized empire of street gangs. Number 2. MS-13 versus Mexican cartels. A violent struggle across borders. 2000s to present, U.S. and Central America. Since the early 2000s, the underworld conflict between MS-13, Mara Salvatrucha, and Mexican cartels, along with their affiliates in both the U.S. and Central America, has escalated into a brutal and complex war. This struggle spans multiple countries, prison systems, and criminal economies, fueled by drugs, extortion, arms trafficking, and control over human smuggling routes. While both sides are engaged in organized crime, their structures, histories, and territorial strategies differ significantly, leading to frequent clashes, shifting alliances, and mounting bloodshed. MS-13 was founded in Los Angeles in the 1980s by Salvadoran immigrants fleeing civil war. Initially a small gang formed for mutual protection against rival groups, MS-13 quickly grew into a violent organization known for its brutality, strict loyalty codes, and distinctive tattoos. Over time, mass deportations of gang members back to Central America, particularly to El Salvador, Honduras, and Guatemala, allowed MS-13 to evolve into a transnational criminal group with deep roots in both the U.S. and Latin America. By the 2000s, MS-13 was heavily involved in extortion, murder for hire, human trafficking, and increasingly, the drug trade. Its decentralized structure and fierce territorial control made it a dominant force in many urban areas across Central America and in immigrant-heavy neighborhoods in U.S. cities such as Los Angeles, Washington, D.C., and Houston. Mexican drug cartels such as the Sinaloa Cartel, Los Zetas, Jalisco New Generation Cartel, CJNG, and Gulf Cartel have long dominated the global drug trade. By the 2000s, as U.S. demand for cocaine, heroin, methamphetamine, and later fentanyl surged, these cartels extended their operations deep into Central America and the United States. Cartels established smuggling corridors through the U.S.-Mexico border and used local gangs and affiliates to distribute drugs in American cities. They also began forming temporary alliances with prison gangs and street-level dealers to protect routes and eliminate rivals. As MS-13 expanded its influence and sought control over territory, it inevitably clashed with Mexican cartel interests, particularly over control of human trafficking routes, extortion zones, and local drug markets. In Central America, MS-13's dominance in urban slums and rural transit areas brought it into direct conflict with cartels pushing southward. For example, Los Zetas, a notoriously violent cartel, entered Guatemala and Honduras to secure trafficking routes, often using paramilitary force. This led to fierce shootouts with MS-13 cliques defending their areas. In El Salvador, multiple massacres in border towns have been tied to Cartel Mara conflicts. In the United States, while Mexican cartels have generally avoided direct street-level visibility, they rely on local gangs to handle retail distribution. MS-13 has at times worked as a distributor for cartel-supplied drugs, but tensions flare when cartels demand loyalty, exclusive territory, or control over the gang's other activities, especially human trafficking. In places like Houston and Los Angeles, these turf disputes have led to murders, dismemberments, and disappearances. Much of the power dynamics play out within prisons. MS-13 has a strong prison network in El Salvador and U.S. correctional facilities. Inmates coordinate extortion schemes, assassinations, and recruitment. Cartel affiliates, especially those linked to the Mexican Mafia, La M, often run drug distribution and taxation systems behind bars. In California, La M has exerted pressure on MS-13 and other Central American gangs to pay street taxes or fall in line with larger cartel-aligned networks. This has led to intermittent violence and standoffs, though temporary truces have occurred under leadership deals. In some cases, MS-13 members have refused to fall under Mexican Mafia influence, fueling low-level wars in neighborhoods and prisons alike. From the 2000s onward, law enforcement agencies in both the U.S. and Central America have targeted MS-13 and cartel operations. High-profile raids, RICO cases, and anti-gang laws in El Salvador and the U.S. have put intense pressure on MS-13, jailing thousands of its members. Meanwhile, Mexico's war on drugs, especially from 2006 onward, splintered some cartels while allowing others like CJNG to rise. This chaos has not ended the conflict, it has only decentralized it. As MS-13 regroups and adapts, and cartels shift their focus from cocaine to synthetic drugs like fentanyl, the competition for smuggling routes and local control remains fierce. Today, the war between MS-13 and cartel affiliates is less about large-scale battles and more about micro-conflicts, street corners, transit hubs, and prison blocks. In Central America, MS-13 remains entrenched, though recent mass arrests and authoritarian crackdowns in El Salvador have weakened its public presence. In the U.S., the gang continues to operate in immigrant communities, often covertly, while Mexican cartels maintain their role as wholesale suppliers of narcotics. The rivalry has had a devastating toll: thousands dead, countless displaced, and communities trapped between violent criminal groups. While occasional cooperation occurs when profits align, the underlying tension between MS-13's grassroots territorialism and cartel hegemony ensures the conflict remains alive. Number 1. The Yakuza versus Chinese triads, underworld conflict in Japan and Southeast Asia during the 1990s. In the shadowy world of East Asian organized crime, few rivalries have been as tense and far-reaching as the conflict between Japan's Yakuza and China's triads during the 1990s. As globalization, deregulation, and illicit trade expanded across the Asia-Pacific region, so too did the ambitions and rivalries of these powerful criminal syndicates. The 1990s saw a significant uptick in competition and violence between these groups, especially in Japan, Hong Kong, Taiwan, and key Southeast Asian cities like Bangkok and Manila. At stake were control over drug trafficking, human smuggling, weapons sales, and underground economies that were worth billions. The Yakuza, Japan's centuries-old criminal syndicate, had long operated with a degree of tolerance from Japanese authorities. With their deep roots in Japanese society, nationalist ideology, and structured hierarchy, Yakuza groups like the Yamaguchi-gumi and Sumiyoshi Kai controlled everything from gambling and prostitution to real estate and construction contracts. By the 1990s, the Yakuza had also begun expanding internationally, investing in Southeast Asian properties, laundering money through foreign banks, and becoming increasingly involved in global drug trafficking, particularly methamphetamine and heroin. Their influence extended into legitimate businesses, political circles, and international markets, with front companies stretching from Tokyo to Bangkok. Meanwhile, the Chinese triads, organized crime networks based primarily in Hong Kong, Macau, Taiwan, and mainland China, had grown increasingly sophisticated. With Hong Kong's handover to China on the horizon and the liberalization of trade throughout Asia, triad groups such as the 14K, Sun Yi On, and Wo Xing Wo expanded rapidly across Southeast Asia and into Australia, Canada, and the United States. These groups thrived in the chaos of border regions, using bribery, intimidation, and sophisticated trafficking operations to gain dominance in heroin distribution, arms smuggling, and extortion. As both groups expanded their reach, competition became inevitable, particularly in areas where their territories overlapped. The Yakuza had long maintained influence over Japan's nightlife and port industries, but during the 1990s, Chinese triads began infiltrating these sectors, especially in cities like Osaka, Kobe, and Yokohama, where large immigrant populations provided cover for underground triad networks. One of the main battlegrounds was drug trafficking. The Yakuza traditionally managed domestic methamphetamine production and distribution in Japan, while the triads controlled the heroin trade from the Golden Triangle region, where Thailand, Laos, and Myanmar meet. When triad networks began shipping heroin directly into Japanese markets, sometimes through ethnic Chinese brokers or shipping companies, violent clashes erupted between rival distributors. There were several unsolved murders in Tokyo and Osaka during the early 1990s tied to these disputes, often marked by torture and execution-style killings that bore triad hallmarks. In Southeast Asia, particularly Thailand and the Philippines, Yakuza groups attempted to dominate Japanese tourist and business enclaves by establishing local partners and extorting protection money from clubs, casinos, and bars. This put them into direct conflict with entrenched triad elements who had already secured local police protection and political connections. Violent turf wars in cities like Bangkok and Manila led to shootouts and assassinations, often involving contract killers flown in from abroad. The growing violence and economic influence of both the Yakuza and triads eventually triggered stronger responses from regional governments. Japan began enforcing stricter anti-gang laws in the mid-1990s, targeting Yakuza bank accounts, real estate holdings, and political ties. Meanwhile, Hong Kong authorities, especially in the lead-up to the 1997 handover, began cracking down on triad groups with increasing aggression. This period also saw a rise in international cooperation between law enforcement agencies. Japan, China, Hong Kong, and ASEAN countries began sharing intelligence and coordinating operations aimed at dismantling transnational syndicates. These efforts had some success in disrupting trafficking networks and curbing gang-related violence, though the deeply rooted nature of these organizations made them difficult to dismantle entirely. By the late 1990s, the intensity of direct violence between the Yakuza and triads had diminished, but the rivalry shifted into more subtle forms: economic influence, cybercrime, and political corruption. The two organizations adapted to new realities, increasingly cooperating or tolerating each other's presence in certain sectors when profits made confrontation too costly. Today, the legacy of this underworld war continues to shape the landscape of Asian organized crime. The 1990s served as a turning point, demonstrating both the limits of regional criminal empires and the consequences of unchecked expansion. The conflict between the Yakuza and the triads was not just about turf, it was a struggle for dominance in an emerging global black market.